Good morning. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all so much for being here today. We're really glad to have you. This is our second annual Building a Competitive Border Conference here at the Wilson Center, hosted by the Mexico Institute in partnership with some friends that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But we're really excited about this. Last year, we had a conference, I say the second annual, the titles changed slightly. Last year, we called it Envisioning a Competitive U.S.-Mexico Border. We decided to take it one step further, and this year we're actually going to build it. So right here on stage, we're going to start to get into the construction process. We did this again, and we decided to make this an annual event because we realized that there was a lot of value in holding a conference like this and sort of putting it on the calendar and making it an event that everybody could know about and look forward to each year. We want to make sure that the conversations about the U.S.-Mexico border in Washington go beyond the sort of normal conversations that we tend to hear here about immigration and drugs and some of those issues. Not that they're not important, but we think there's another very important story to tell that has to do with the economy and leveraging the border, making sure that the border is understood to be an opportunity, not just a challenge to doing business. So, with that in mind, we learned an important lesson from the conference last year was that if we do put it on the calendar and we invite people and we partner with the right people, we'll actually have a really important group of folks from the border region, business people, city officials. We have the mayor of McAllen here with us today. Thanks very much for coming. To come up here to work with, to talk to Washington, but also to talk to each other. And that's one of the things that we've learned over the years. There's not enough conversations that happen between the border cities. So folks from San Diego and Tijuana talking to the folks from Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, the folks in the Matamoros and Brownsville, McAllen and Reynosa, et cetera. And so we find this to be a great opportunity to do both of those things at once, right? To improve in our slight contribution, coordination along the border, but also to make sure, very importantly, that the border has a strong voice here in Washington. And as I said, we couldn't do that alone, so we're very happy to co-host with the Border Trade Alliance today. Noe Garcia, Jesse Hereford are here with us, among many of the board members as well of the Border Trade Alliance. And the AEM, the Asociación de Empresarios Mexicanos, Lorena Montes de Oca, Eduardo Bravo, Glafiro. We have lots of other representatives from Mario from San Diego with us here today as well. Thank you all for being great partners to both of you and your organizations. And we have lots of other partners in the program today. Manat Jones, Global Strategies. Michael Comunez is here representing both AEM and Manat Jones. Thank you. Pro Mexico, the Borderplex Alliance, IBC Bank, Constellation Brands, Delphi, SMB Infrastructure, the Ansel Duas and McAllen Hidalgo Bridges. As you see, it takes a village to make something like this happen, and so we're glad to be working with all of them and many more of you to make the event happen today. We have a fantastic set of speakers, a fantastic program ahead of us today. We're really excited to have with us several members of Congress, Congressman Henry Cuellar, Congressman Hurd from here on the U.S. side, as well as Senator Ernesto Ruffo from Mexico. Very delighted to have you back, Ambassador Sarukhan. Thanks for a board member of ours at the Mexico Institute and former ambassador to the United States from Mexico to be with us and pitch in today. We also have the head of Customs and Border Protection coming, Jeronimo Gutierrez, the head of the North American Development Bank, speaking with us, Assistant Secretary Alan Burson, Ambassador Alejandro Estivil from representing Mexico here in Washington, and a number of other fantastic panelists. So without further delay, let's just get started and begin jumping into the meat of the conversations. I want to welcome to the podium Roger McCrary, the Director of Global Customs with Delphi, to introduce our first panel. Thanks very much.
Good morning and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our first panel today. Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan is a member of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute Advisory Board and is a former Mexican ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Sarukhan has served in many roles throughout his distinguished career, including Chief of Policy Planning for the Foreign Ministry in Mexico and Consul General to New York City. He also held prominent positions in President Calderon's campaign and administration. He's now active in various endeavors, including the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and the Philharmonic Orchestra of the Americas. Ambassador Sarukhan will moderate a panel featuring Congressman Henry Cuellar of Texas, Congressman Hurd, also of Texas, and from the Mexican Senate, Ernesto Ruffo. The panel will discuss strengthening border competitiveness. Ambassador Sarukhan.
Good morning. Good morning to all. Buenos días, señor. Bienvenido. It's a great privilege to be here on the stage with dear friends and new friends of the Mexico-U.S. bilateral relationship, and particularly of one of the most sensitive areas of the bilateral agenda, which is our border, our common border. A border that lately, unfortunately, has become a bit of a political piñata, especially as we hurtle down towards the presidential primaries and elections in the United States, but nonetheless a border that is key to the development, the well-being, the security, the prosperity of both nations. I used to say when I was ambassador, and you heard me say this several times, Henry, that we are blessed. If you look at trade and you look at NAFTA today and what they've done to the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, that we are blessed with a 21st century trade agenda, trade relationship. You know, the $1.4 billion a day of goods that go back and forth are a very powerful testament to that. We have a 20th century framework because NAFTA was negotiated and devised 20 years ago, and we are all hoping that we can modernize this edifice on the backs of TPP. But if you look at our border infrastructure, we've got a border infrastructure of the 19th century. The fact that a new railroad crossing is going forward, and it's the first railroad crossing that will have been built on the Mexico-U.S. border since the Mexican Revolution of 1910. This isn't the border infrastructure that we had before NAFTA. This is the border infrastructure that we had basically 100 years ago. So looking at this issue of how do we upgrade, modernize our border infrastructure is a critical issue. The three of you have played a very important role in this debate, and the three of you have played a very important role in what is one, I think, the most prescient questions when we look at the border, especially post 9/11, which is how do we converge and harmonize two very important goals, but which sometimes run at odds with one another: common prosperity and common security. And how do we create a border that behaves and becomes much more like a membrane than a wall? A membrane allows the good stuff to come in and filters the bad stuff out. But what we've really had is, because of infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure, and the inability of the federal governments on both sides of the border to really focus and put holistic attention on the border, we've got some serious roadblocks as we look at competitiveness, modernization of our border infrastructure. Let me start with the idea is that we have a very fluid conversation. I'm relishing the fact that it's the first time that I can get to interrogate members of Congress, so instead of the other way around. But let me start with one issue which we've always discussed, and especially for you that come from the border, live on the border, represent constituencies on the border. Why do Mexico City and Washington, D.C. have such a hard time understanding the dynamics on the border? I have to believe it's something more than just they're thousands of miles away. There's something structural in how our governments are designed and put together bureaucratically that has prevented both Mexico City and Washington in getting a better sense and appraisal of how to deal with the issues and what the real needs on the ground are for border communities on both sides of our common border. If you don't mind, can we start with our Mexican guest and the senator from Mexico, Senador?
Arturo, buenos días.
Qué gusto verte.
Hello. Well, pretty interesting way of addressing this meeting, building a competitive border. As Mr. Sarukhan said, we from the border and Washington and Mexico City so far away. And it seems to me that, first of all, is the complexity of the executive power. There are so many different departments or secretariats. I'm a former commissioner for the border with President Fox. And we had this commission that looped 16 departments of the Mexican government. But 9/11 happened, 2001. And the American government went dark. I mean, no real scope of works on how to connect on many things. The security was kind of darkening everything. That's why so much security that when entering the office, the building, this morning. Well, the world changed. And happening on this kind of dark moment, we had to dissolve the Presidential Commission because we were doing nothing. I'm trying to make it back again. So I propose a Senate building in order to coordinate the federal Mexican government at the border. I think it's a focal point or a focal issue because Mexico City is on the national priorities, Washington as well. On the border, it is just there, but it moves. Trade, commerce, it's just always progressing, even though government. So I would, in general, make that general statement.
Congressman Cuellar, you've been at the heart for a long time of many of the discussions that the governments of Mexico and the United States have had on everything from pure hard security on the border. How do we prevent transnational organized crime moving drugs in one direction, guns and bulk cash in the other, or potential organizations, fundamentalist organizations that would seek to harm both our countries. You've also been at the heart of some of the more important discussions regarding 21st century mechanisms to facilitate trade. You know, this whole discussion over pre-inspection, and I say this with absolutely no doubt in my mind, the very important measure that has finally been taken by the Mexican government to change the law that will allow customs agents to pre-inspect merchandise in Mexican facilities will be, if that moves forward in the way that we think it will have a very profound impact on facilitating trade. Is this just an issue of sort of the bureaucratic makeup of both countries? The fact, for example, that the agencies that deal with border issues on both sides of the border are pretty different. The fact that, for example, Customs in Mexico reports to Hacienda, the fact that Customs here is part of the DHS family that was created in the aftermath of 9/11. Does this bureaucratic disconnect have something to do with the fact that it's so hard to sort of line up all our ducks as we think of the border and the border issues?
Yes, sir. First of all, Ambassador, I appreciate you being here with us. I've always said that one of the best ambassadors I've worked with, and I'm talking about not just from Mexico, but different folks, has been Arturo here. So, Arturo, I really appreciate the good work that you did for Mexico. Really, I said one of his best assets, which you get a complicated issue and simplify it down to a level that I can understand it, is something that I think one of your special skills. Senador, un placer estar con usted. My good friend, Will, it's always a pleasure being with you down from Texas. I think it's a combination of things. One is not only the viewpoint of bureaucrats, and I'll talk about that, but it's also the policymakers. I start off with a basic premise that the Rio Bravo or the Rio Grande does not divide us, but actually unites us. There's some people that see it the different way. They want to see the Rio Grande as a division. They want to see a wall. And it's just unfortunate they have that perspective. They don't understand the interconnection that we have with Mexico. If something comes in from China, we'll have about 4% parts. An import from China will have about 4% of American products in it. Something comes in from the United States, it will have about 40%. And just during this trade agreement within my own party, I had I don't want to say heated discussion, but I had a lively discussion with one of our ranking persons on that, because they started blaming Mexico on this. And I said, whoa. And then we got into some of the numbers. You know, every day there was $1.3 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico. 6 million American jobs are being created here because of Mexico. And people just don't understand the economics, but they'll see the security part, and that's all they see. And it's not only the policymakers. I think all you have to do is turn on the TV and you see the policymakers, but even our own agencies. Let me give you an example. I sit in the appropriations, just one committee in the appropriations. I had to put a writer there in the appropriation for CBP, and I think you got the CBP commissioner later on, because the problem we had was that even the officers at the front line, the way they treated Mexicanos coming across was just horrible. They made it sound like 99% of the folks coming in were criminals. When they were coming in to spend dollars over here, you know, whatever, open up businesses, but they acted like every single Mexicano was bad. So we put it part of the budget for CBP, so they had to make that change. In Laredo, David Hergerson and Joseph and other folks did a great job. They took it on. I think they call it now Pride, but it's now part of the law because even the officers there, the frontline people, were just treating people horrible. So it's not only the policymakers, but even going through the agencies that you talk about. There's a lot of things that we've been working on, not only the security, because every country has to go through its ways to protect its borders, but on the economic part of it is we've been focusing on several things. One of them is there's a bill that we're going to be filing, but we're going to hope that we get it in the appropriations, and it's very simple. It's a very simple thing. That is, if you look at America and Canada, they have looking beyond the border. And if you look at the principles over there, what we're trying to do is do exactly the pre-clearance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, exactly on the southern border. So we're going to put that in the appropriations. We already got some language in, but we want to put it in appropriations and pass a bill, and I'm sure Will and I will go on. But the pre-clearance, let me just give you the story how this started. At that time, it was Alfredo Gutierrez Mina. We had a meeting with them up here in Washington, and Alfredo now, he's a Supreme Court judge now, and I remember he's a good friend, and when we have the opening in Laredo, hopefully in August or so, I remember Alfredo, and he was like this, and he kept saying, nope, 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 nope. At the end of the night, he said, well, I'll think about it, and I told the city of Laredo, we got it now. He's open to it now, but that process there, because it was both, the CBP was there and everybody was like, no, it's not going to work. And now what we're going to have is in Laredo to start off with, and it's going to go in other places also. We already have Mexican customs there. It's a pilot program that tested everything there. Laredo built a new facility that houses both customs, American customs, Mexican customs, computerized, everything's there. Everything's ready to go. We were waiting for the other side, for the Mexicanos. At one time, it was basically the gun issue came up. I talked to Secretary Osorio, I talked to the Secretary of Defense. Can we do this? Can we do this without legislation? Came down that we had to, Mexico had to pass the legislation. It passed. So now there'll be two sites over there, and one side in Laredo to start off. And I think if everything goes fine with this, they're in the process of signing the memorandum. I think this will be a fresh new start for the U.S. and Mexico. And this is what we need to focus on, because everybody has the lens of security, but it's more than the lenses of security. You got to look at the economics part of it.
Thank you. Congressman Hurd, we have just last week had what I think is one of the most relevant mechanisms of the bilateral relationship today, which is, as part of the high economic level dialogue, a renewed engagement between the private sectors of both countries. The U.S.-Mexico CEO dialogue met last week in Washington. They met with several government officials. They met with their counterparts. Has part of the problem also been that both federal governments, until recently, have tended to look at border issues more from the perspective of this is a federal government attribution, and now finally we're starting to have local governments, state governments, and more importantly and critically, the private sector come in as co-stakeholders of driving this new different vision for the border. Think of some of the, in my book, most exciting stuff that is happening on the border, and you've got the footprint of the private sector, this new bridge that will connect the San Diego-Tijuana airports to decongest San Diego, as we all know, has a very short runway, so being able to link these two terminals and provide for trans-Pacific flights out of Tijuana and use San Diego as a connector hub could have a phenomenal impact on the Mexicali, San Diego, Tijuana mega region of the border. From where you stand, how do you see the convergence between local officials, state officials, federal officials, and the private sector?
Right, I think it's the private sector has finally gotten tired of waiting, right? And you know, and I think the federal government is realizing, let's get out of the way. And I know Congressman Cuellar and Beto and Rourke and a lot of the folks in BTA have led on getting some legislation that allows local municipalities to lease land to the government in order to facilitate, traffic. Or, we're looking at an idea about how to make sure like states are allowed to keep some of their federal dollars from the highway fund in order to invest, on infrastructure on the border. And so I think this is the private sector providing some interesting solutions because the federal government's not going to be able to do it. And your earlier question. It's not just a disconnect between Washington and Mexico City on the border. It's from the border all the way to Washington, D.C. And, I represent 820 miles of the border. I have more border than any member of Congress. And, when I first got up here to Washington, D.C., everybody asked, all the press asked me, how'd the black dude get elected in the Hispanic district, right? And, yeah. That's a secret, Henry. That's a secret.
Henry and his colleagues want the secret.
Yeah, exactly. But part of it is because I get the border, right? And what's unfortunate is people don't realize how far Matamoros is from Ciudad Juarez, right? People don't realize that some of the violence in Ciudad Juarez was almost 10 years ago, not now. And so, whenever anybody reads anything, and it happens in Mexico, they think it's all one place, right? Until you get down there and see it, you realize, how important that part of the region is. And that's why I look at part of my responsibility is getting a number of my colleagues down to the border to see it. We were able to take a few freshman congressmen down to El Paso and see the area, and the Borderplex Alliance and the folks at BTA, making sure that we're exposing people to what's really going on. And I sit on the Homeland Security Committee. I'm on the board. I'm the vice chair of the Border and Maritime Subcommittee. And what I always tell people is, listen, we can secure our border and facilitate the movement of goods and services and people and animals, at the same time. And I'm going to start using your membrane example. I'll make sure it is attribution. So, this is something that we can achieve, and let's make sure that we're getting all the good traffic back and forth. Let's get that. Let's make it faster, and let's make it smoother. And then we can have Border Patrol and ICE focus on the folks that are really, trying to do our two countries harm. And if we're able to do that, the border's going to operate even better. I don't understand why aren't our land ports like airports. Right? Why aren't those ports of entry a place where you walk in and get a Starbucks or whatever, buy a T-shirt, and you again, that stuff that will help generate income to go back into the facility, to the infrastructure, so that we no longer have a 19th century infrastructure. So how do we keep some of the fees that we're collecting at those ports of entries there, to go back into that infrastructure. So
you've touched upon two, I think, very, very important sort of buzzwords that are very relevant not only to this panel but to the general discussion that we will be having today. The first one is narrative, and how do you change perceptions and narratives, which I'll address in a second. Let me start with the second one, which is process. How can federal governments better work with the Mexican Congress, the U.S. Congress, so that the appropriation and authorization processes that are happening there dovetail? Because I'll be very frank, I sometimes, and you and I talked about this in the past, as an ambassador, as a sitting ambassador, I would sometimes see initiatives being cobbled together by members of Congress that had absolutely no correlation to what was actually going on the ground in the border. It was as if we were talking about a border that existed 20 years ago. It's as if nothing had happened between 9/11 and the 21st century in terms of what Mexico and the United States have done to secure the border. So how do we better use the legislative processes of sausage making, of making bills that are relevant and plug into and dovetail what the federal governments may be trying to achieve? Because sometimes I had the sense that both in the Mexican Congress and in the US Congress, there were bills that sort of seemed to go countercurrent to what the two governments were trying to do and achieve. So how can we better ensure that both federal governments are plugged into the legislative process on both sides so that they can be mutually reinforcing? And whoever wants to take the first stab, please do so.
Senador.
Well, I'm the president for the Northern Border Commission of the Senate. And we are only 3 senators. I wanted 15. But everyone wanted to go on the budgetary situation and security, internal government. So it begins there. I mean, it's kind of the pole of attraction of politics is capital cities. So that's why I'm talking on reconstructing this coordination of the federal government in the border, so you can look at things from there, not from Mexico City or Washington. So you begin having priority from there, and then you define projects, procedures, and you push them from there. The bill I'm proposing, it's actually making it a commission, not an intersecretarial or interdepartamental. But the difference here is to incorporate, without vote but with voice, governors, mayors, local legislative communities, so you can have the very next smaller focal point, like city to city. And in that way, you have a lot of folks on that issue pushing for the purpose. And I'm also in that proposal wanting to, I hope the Mexican Treasury accepts, to incorporate a trust. For once you have already approved, once you already have approved a project, the funds for that go on to the trust, so it doesn't get skimmed out from you in the years to come, and so you can have security on the investor part.
Would you've been there? Would sort of establishing 2 border czars in the U.S. and in Mexico that would be the pivots and the air traffic controllers of anything that has to do with the border from a holistic perspective, security, trade, infrastructure, water, does it make sense? We've seen these figures work and fail in the past.
Well, watch it. Alan Burson is going to be here later.
Should we? Well,
Just kidding.
But Henry, even Alan.
He did a good job.
Alan
worked very hard.
did a very good job, but Alan was not empowered to bring all the agencies on the U.S. government under the same tent, under his coordination, and we know that that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
So does creating a sort of Congress mandating the creation of 2 bureaucratic focal points, whether they're border czars or people in the NSC and in Pinos in the Mexican presidential, does that make sense, or is that a duplication of the bureaucratic structures that exist today?
Well, again, if you have a border czar, a Mexicano and a Americano that don't have powers, then it's not really worth it, quite honestly. My approach to answer the first question that you asked and going on to this one is basically, how do we get folks to work with? I spent a lot of time in Mexico. I haven't been there for a few months, but I was there going like every other month in Mexico, and then we have Michael McCall and other folks that we're doing, going with our counterparts over there, including the Canadians for the first time, which is something important. But what I do is I work a lot with these folks here, the Wilson Center, the BTA, the Mexicano Empresarios, new folks in the block, but hopefully they'll be part of the BTA where we all work together and get a lot of ideas for them. This is why yesterday in the appropriations, what I do is, because they're all different agencies, and what I'm trying to do in the appropriations is just to add language in the different agencies to try to get them to work together. Because the best way to get somebody's attention is to address the budget itself. First thing we did yesterday at Victory, as you know, the Wilson Center has about a $10.5 million budget. A couple years ago, they wanted to zero you out, the majority. This time I asked for the 10.5. We're $80,000 below. But we got 420,000, which is, pretty good on that. First, agencies or centers like the center here does an outstanding job, and this is why we support them. BTA also have given us a lot of ideas, and they work with both sides, the private sector and governmental officials. And let me just give you a series of things that I've added in the appropriations process. ¿Cómo estamos? Is just give you a couple things that we added things. So, some of them have to deal with, they're all with the border or Mexico. For example, a couple years ago, they were trying to take out some money on that border infrastructure. We are one time $100 million down. They zeroed down. I think we put it back at 5 because they wanted to put 0. We put that money in there. There's a North American Wetland Conservation Fund. I wanted to focus on the Rio Grande, but they said it would be an earmark, which I disagree with them. But they did add $855,000 that we can use above the President's request that I need your help to make sure that we focus on the Rio Grande itself. We added migrant workers also for the first time. We supported with the majority. Added language, what we're going to be supporting EPA working. I know that's toxic work sometimes using the EPA, but the EPA working with the agriculture to protect migrant children, workers, where children under the age of 16 for the first time ever, minimum age cannot handle the pesticides, as you know. And to me, it becomes personal because my father was a mother and father were migrant workers itself. We added language with the BTA. I know when I was in San Diego, we mentioned this also. Jesse, as you know, we worked on it. This has to do also with banking issues. The federal government thinks that if money crosses the border, automatically they think it's laundered money. But how do you have a free trade agreement? How do you have trade without legitimate transactions? So by hopefully today we have an appropriations, well, we should, it's part of the manager's amendment already, that will get everybody together so we can come up with rules so banks and anybody dealing with money across the border can deal with legitimate money. If it's bad money, it's a different thing that we have to deal with. On transportation also, on the freight corridors, the administration had the freight corridors starting about 150 miles away from the border. And I told them, Laredo, for example, handles 12,000 trailers a day. I've never seen a trailer jump 150 miles to San Antonio. So why is the freight corridors, national freight corridors starting 150 miles from the border? We put language, they start at the land ports, including the infrastructure language in there. We also added language also there for Mexico. In the United States, I know this was important to Sergio Alcocer, and we talked about it a couple days, making sure that we get the Department of State to use more of their money for U.S.-Mexico academic exchanges at high school, college, postgraduate levels, and we're hoping that we can push this because, Mexico is not the number one students both ways, having students. Also put language there. There's a $265 million pot of money that calls to make sure that we do more microenterprise, microfinance programs to promote economic in Mexico and Central America. The train issue, as you know, back in 2008, we had an amendment. There was going to be a study to have a train from Oklahoma to San Antonio. I added an amendment, say, because the border doesn't stop in San Antonio, and we're hoping that this will have 2 outlets from San Antonio, one to McAllen, and another one going from Laredo to San Antonio, Laredo to Monterrey to have one of those trains up there. They had no protocols. The State Department, the Texas Department of Transportation said, hey, we need your help because the Mexicanos have different protocols. We have different protocols with rail. So we added some language dealing with that particular item. So we added many other things. I don't want to take up the time. But the only thing I want to say, Mr. Ambassador, members, this folks here, a lot of the ideas that we get on it is from the Wilson Center and especially from BTA, and because they're on the ground. I live on the border. I drink the water. I breathe the air. My family's there. I understand it, but these folks also do it. And that's where I get the ideas from both the Mexican and the other side, because you're right. There's some members that come in theoretically, and I always say this: the further more you live away from the border, the more interest in your ideas or legislation dealing with the border. It's like me telling somebody else in New York, this is what you need. And I've told some of the members, if you want a wall, I'll be happy to support a bill to put a wall around your city and your state if that's what you want. But they just don't understand the process. But again, to answer your question, how do we get the processes? Work with groups like this and get the champions. There's folks like Will and the Senador, especially you. The new folks that we have from the Embajada have been fantastic. Make sure we talk to each other, but we gotta match reality with, and don't go on perception. A lot of people pass things on perception.
As a board member of the Mexico Institute, thank you for that ringing endorsement of the work that's being done here. So, processes, these two gentlemen being veterans of the Mexico-U.S. interparliamentary process. And I'm sure that both have also seen what I thought for many years was probably one of the most exciting and promising mechanisms, not at the federal level, of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda, which was the Border Governors Conference. Both mechanisms seem to have run out of ideas and of gas. I can say this now. I couldn't say it when I was ambassador because it was the legislative, and we were very careful in. But the interparliamentary seems to be lacking the ability to take advantage of the fact that you've got X number of members of Congress together for a day and a half, either in Mexico or in the U.S., to really converge these sort of, that what Senator Ruffo is doing in the commission in the Mexican Senate dovetails with what you gentlemen are doing on border infrastructure or security issues or water on the U.S. side of the border. How, as someone who's coming in with a fresh perspective, how do you modernize, upgrade, improve these mechanisms?
So in my whopping 21 weeks experience, what I've seen is that, so this idea of having a border czar, I'm nervous about that because I think it takes away from what folks like in Presidio, a little town in West Texas on the border, building a new railway, across the border. What folks in Eagle Pass are trying to do. So you and what's been interesting in a lot of these projects, our Mexican counterparts are further along, moving much more aggressively than our U.S. counterparts. And so, we do need the governors to continue talking, but we also need the head of TxDOT in Texas and his counterpart, across the border to be meeting. We also need, to have our CBP meeting with their officials on the other side, right? So you need to increase the folks that are already responsible for these activities to have a conversation on the other side. Perfect example. Wait, is Hector Serna here? Hector, what's the highway on the Mexican side coming into Eagle Pass?
Highway 57.
Yeah, Highway 57 on the Mexican side, beautiful, right? It's huge, it's big, and then you come over on the U.S. side, and it's a bumpy road, right? We're getting ready to build the Tornillo checkpoint or port of entry. It's going to be gigantic. But we don't have the right infrastructure on the U.S. side, right? And it's gonna put a lot of it's gonna have a huge impact on some of these communities. So the folks that are working those projects, they're the ones that need to be having regular meetings. And then this is something where you incorporate the governors and everybody sees what's already going on, and they can help drive the process.
GSA, how can it be? Because we have.
Yeah, I mean,
we've dealt with GSA.
No, GSA, like example, we had $62 million to fix up Bridge 1 and 2 in Laredo. GSA puts out a bid. Apparently, they had to come back because the contractor, it was too much money. They came out at a high number, and one of the problems is we should have a better competitive way of dealing with this. With the $62 million, we could have done a lot more than that. So now we're in the process of doing this. But the reason I mentioned this is I told them I want to have, same way you've been saying, I've been telling these folks, I said, why are airports different from the land ports? I mean, you guys just, first of all, you mistreat them, you put them out in the sun, and so I couldn't get GSA to agree to put something there for water, drinks, vendors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know about T-shirts, but I mean, but everything else. And they refused till a new bureaucrat with a new thinking, David Hergensen, comes in. He says, we'll make it work. We'll make a space, and we're going to have that. Once we do Bridge 1 and 2, we actually will have the private vendors there, and we just couldn't get them to do that. So GSA has some good folks, but they're on a set amount, and that's why today's budget will have zero money for GSA, just so you know. But again, I just I disagree on that. But we should put a lot more money, and hopefully at the end, when we do an omnibus bill. But the other thing is, because we can get GSA to move fast enough, BTA, what do? In the appropriations, we added public-private partnership. Added the public-private partnership. We had to deal with the former GSA director, which was very good, Dan. We worked with CBP, and we got into the law and the appropriations where we have public-private partnerships. Not only the service over time, but also the infrastructure and the equipment. And again, Arturo and I emphasize, the folks here is where we get a lot of the good ideas from.
As you can see, and we're running out of time, and I would love to be able to open the floor for at least a few minutes of questions. But as you can see, these three gentlemen play a very important role in pouring the proverbial Drano down the pipes and unclogging some of these challenges and roadblocks that we see as to how both federal governments and both national governments converge on working together and synergistically on the border. The last question that I would ask the three of you, and we can start from left to right, if you had a magic wand and you could do one thing on the border, one thing, to magically change something on the border, what would you do, Ernesto?
Well, my worry is that about continuity, because as people in government change and then focal things again move. So that's why I'm talking about this commission. Will is worried about the SAR word, but the one you had was on about security and drugs and all that, and that was scary, yes. I'm talking about a commission which is a general issues, the different environment, education, of course, logistics and transportation, the bridges, all about that. So we need a control tower to coordinate the federal government because it's too complex. And then federal government oversees the region and the locality. So that's why you got to incorporate these guys there. So my focal idea, maybe my deviation by being the coordinator of federal government in Mexico makes me say this, but I would like to see that.
So Senator Ruffo would like an air traffic controller. Congressman Hurd?
Some of the fees that are being collected at the ports of entry to be able to be used to go back into the ports of entry, right? That's going to help infrastructure. That's going to help people. We get more blue shirts there, and they're going to get more traffic going. That's a way that you allow them to evolve based on how many people come through.
Congressman Cuellar?
I would put a border SAR with you as the head of it. That's what I would do. Just kidding. No.
I second that.
I'm going to start choking on my water here.
I think there's so many ideas. I would just go more on the mindset. I'll start off with my basic premise. We see the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande, as a place that unites us, not divides us, and I think everything will flow from there. I think everything will.
And don't forget the Rio Colorado, where we did some very, very innovative stuff in the previous administration. So let's open up for. Can you give me 10 minutes so we can 5 minutes beyond the 9:30 mark? We'll take some questions. If you could please just identify yourself and provide some affiliation for our members of Congress? This isn't a shy group.
Good morning, Mario Lopez from San Diego, Tijuana. I'm from IM. Great to be here. One of the comments I think that I would say coming from San Diego, Tijuana is that you can't resolve any of these issues without having people from the border communities be part of these discussions. And obviously you represent border communities, but it's different to have representatives elected that actually border stakeholders. And I think that's one of the key things that has been missing in some of the discussions in DC and Mexico City is that the border stakeholders are not engaged. We haven't been engaged. The people who live on the border, such as ourselves, were the last ones to find out of any policy that's been developed. And I think the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico starts from the border inward, not the other way around. Thank you for the opportunity and
Thank you.
for the event.
Would any of
You know,
like
I
to-
added the language many years ago to establish this high-level talk that Joe Biden and the other folks are working on, put it again in the appropriation bill. But again, even in those talks, or even what the U.S. Chamber does, that we were talking about it last night, it's folks from the U.S. and Mexico, but I don't see the border represented. It's amazing. And even when I deal with some of the folks in Washington, it's still, they have a different perspective itself. And I agree with you 100%. Last time I was in your area just a few months ago, it's the same thing. I mean, I think folks need to spend time there on the border, talk to the folks. And if there's any conversations, you got to include the folks because that's where the interaction happens itself. So I'll go back again, and it's not a bait political advertisement for at the center, the Border Trade Alliance, the Empresarios, and the other folks. We worked together in many ways. But you're absolutely right. That's what's lacking, and we got to do a much better job, even among our friends, if you know what I mean by that.
Yeah, and I rarely do anything without consulting the folks that are at the border. So I agree with 100%.
Do we have someone here? Could you just wait for the... Thank you.
Jim Darling from McAllen. One thing that's affected us on a day-to-day basis that you haven't mentioned is the violence in northern Mexico. And I don't know, I've been to the interior of Mexico recently, and we've seen the Mexican government seems to have control over the Central Highlands and those areas where the automobile plants are going on, but the border is still an issue. And what efforts are we having either on the U.S. side or the Mexican side to deal with that?
Yeah. Well,
Anyone?
I'll start off with the Senador.
Boy, oh boy, that's a good one. We have big difficulties on this much money that is moved by drugs that gets into corrupting everything. We need to systematize and move on to a way how to operate strategy in a coordinated fashion. So we are in the process on redefining the security activity. We were organized kind of for normal life. The city police, state police, federal police. Now the Army and the Navy are on the streets in Tamaulipas. And we have a coordination problem. The bad guys have a higher way of organizing. So we're set for a way to confront the criminal activity, and the criminal guys are one level higher. So we're studying that this next period of sessions in the Senate and the Congress will address how to solve this. We're talking about a single command in order to coordinate all of the security forces, like in the state of Tamaulipas, but this is still on discussion. I'm very worried. Some weeks ago, I met a friend from Tijuana working in Tamaulipas, being the personnel manager, and he said, I think my union guy is being bought out by the bad guys. Can you imagine that? So, yeah, badly we need to do something. And it's about a single command may be the possibility of the solution on coordinating all security forces.
So I spent 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA, and I was a dude in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning collecting intelligence on threats to the homeland. I've been chasing bad guys all across the world for most of my adult life. And one of the trends that is I think, a positive thing that's going to happen in central and northern Mexico is the energy revolution. The fact that, the price per barrel is where it is unfortunate. But as that continues to evolve, it's going to create a revolution, and you're going to have jobs, opportunities in that part of the world. And when you're taking on bad guys, 20% of your operations are kinetic things, cutting off the head of the snake. And our Mexican partners have shown they're pretty good at doing that when they're committed, and we can do everything we can to help with our national resources to help there. But 80% of these kind of activities addressing the underlying issues they're addressing. And so when you have jobs and economy, you're going to have people that are committed to something else, that have another opportunity in order to make money. And I think you're going to see a change. That's a long-term issue, but anything we can do to continue the movement of that revolution is going to be good for the security in northern Mexico, which is great for South Texas and great for the country.
There's a consumption of drugs in the U.S., and every year there's $25 to $30 billion are sent back. So you're talking about a lot of money, billions of dollars up there. So you can understand that Mexico has become, from a transit to a consumer to a lot of things there. And but I'll just say this, and I don't want to who's here from the border, U.S.-Mexico? I don't want to scare you, but to give you an example, using FBI statistics, Laredo or McAllen, El Paso, last year there was about 3 murders per 100,000. Here it's per 100,000, it's about 16 murders. So I don't want to scare you. It's more dangerous here than the border. So I just wanted to let you know. So the border is one thing, and like any other place, we still got work to do on the U.S. side. On the Mexican side, and I know the former ambassador from Mexico said that sometimes I'm a little blunt, but I'll be blunt. Not you, the Medina, who's now a Supreme Court judge. I guess everybody becomes a justice after that. But I said this to...
Not all of us.
No. Hey, you're making money over here and enjoying your life here. But anyway, I'll say this. And I said this to President Calderon, and I said this to President Peña Nieto when he was governor, when he was running, and then when he became the president. The U.S. can help Mexico to the point Mexico wants us to help them. There's a lot more we can do. I understand the sensitivities. I understand the history between the U.S. and Mexico. I understand all that. I understand all that sovereignty. I understand all that. But again, I've always said, if there's a fire, does it matter where that fireman came from? No, I think you just want to turn that fire off. So again, to my friends in Mexico, the U.S. can do a lot more. We'll go as far as you want us to go. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking. I'll leave it at that.
Well, with that note, and I'm getting here the signal to wrap up.
Can we? I know Senator Cornyn is coming in. I think he's the next speaker. Let me just say this, and he's not here, so I'm just bragging about him while he's not here. Senator Cornyn has been very, very, very good for the border. He has. For example, one of the things I added in the appropriations was 55 new immigration judges, first time ever. That we've added this much money on that. So he's going to work with us to keep the 55 immigration judges so we can address the folks that are here, asylums or whatever, so they can have their day in court, number one. Number two, a couple years ago, working with BTA, Senator Cornyn, I on the House side and John Carter, we added 2,000 new CBP officers, because usually it's the men and women in green, not the men and women in blue, which are the CBP officers. We added that. There's a hiccup. They've only hired 700 out of the 2,000. It's been years. And I know there's some folks out there that are waiting this, and Piedras Negras will work with you on this issue, trying to hire more of the CBP officers on that. But I have to say there's Cornyn and Will and other folks, Michael McCall and other folks, on a very bipartisan way, we're sent here not as Democrats or Republicans, but we're sent here to get the job done. Will's done that, and Senator Cornyn, I know he's not here, but just want to say he's done a very good job. He's the number 2 ranking Republican in the Senate, which is very high, but he's been very bipartisan with us. So I just want to say that. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.
Could you please join me in thanking our panelists?
Thank you so much. We're going to move straight into our next session with Senator Cornyn, so please stay in your seats and while we switch the panel up real quick.